What's up, YouTube? It's your boy, Eric Blom, coming at you live with another bedroom reading broadcast. Now, let's roll back the clock. It's been a hard month, since I was booted from the world of academic geosciences, was banned from touching rocks in the fossil labs. So, we're going to keep the spark alive by introducing the world to a little geologic knowledge. And we're going to read some selections from Annals of the Former World, perhaps the best and only example of worthwhile narrative writing in the geosciences. So, a classic by John McPhee, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, originally published in 4 books across 15 years because it's dense. And let's start with Book 1, Basin and Range. I used to sit in class and listen to the terms come floating down the room like paper airplanes. Geology was called a descriptive science, and with its pitted outwash plains and drowned rivers, its hanging tributaries and starved coastlines, it was nothing if not descriptive. It was a fountain of metaphor, of isostatic adjustments and degraded channels, of angular unconformities and shifting divides, of rootless mountains and bitter lakes. Streams eroded headward, digging from 2 sides into mountain or hill, avidly struggling toward one another until the divide between them broke down, and the 2 rivers that did the breaking down became confluent, one yielding to the other, giving up its direction of flow and going the opposite way, to become a single stream, known as stream capture. In the Sierra Nevada, the Yuba had captured the bear. The macho member of a formation in New Mexico was derived in large part from the solution and collapse of another formation. There was fatigued rock, and incompetent rock, and inequigranular fabric in rock. If you bent or folded rock, the inside of the curve was in a state of compression, the outside of the curve was under great tension, and somewhere in the middle was the surface of no strain. Thrust fault, reverse fault, normal fault, the 2 sides were active in every fault. The inclination of a slope on which boulders would stay put was the angle of repose. There seemed, indeed, to be more than a little of the humanities in the subject. Geologists communicated in English, and they could name things in a manner that sent shivers through the bones. They had roof pendants in their discordant batholiths, mosaic conglomerates in desert pavement. There were ultrabasic, deep ocean, mottled green and black rock, or serpentine. There was the slip place of the Barken Dune. In 1841, a paleontologist had decided that the big creatures of the Mesozoic were fearfully great lizards, and had therefore named them dinosaurs. There were festooned crossed beds and limestone sinks, pillow lavas and petrified trees, incised meanders and defeated streams. There were dike swarms and slickensides, explosive pits, volcanic bombs, pulsating glaciers, hogbacks, radiolarian ooze. There was almost enough resonance in some of the terms to stir the adolescent groin. The swelling up of mountains was described as an orogeny, ontogeny, phylogeny, orogeny, accent syllable 2. The antler orogeny, the Avalonian orogeny, the Taconic, Acadian, Alleghanian orogenies, the Laramide orogeny. The center of the United States had a dull geologic history, nothing much being accumulated, nothing much being eroded away. It was just sitting there conservatively. The East had once been radical, had been unstable, reformist, revolutionary in the Paleozoic pulses of 3 or 4 orogenies. Now, for the last 150 million years, the East had been stable and conservative. The far-out stuff was in the far west of the country, wild weirdsma, a leather jacket geology in mirrored shades, with its welded tufts and Franciscan melange, internally deformed, complex beyond analysis. Its strike-slip faults and falling buildings, its boiling springs and fresh volcanics, its extensional disassembling of the earth. There was, to be sure, another side of the page, full of geologic language of the sort that would have attracted Gilbert and Sullivan. Rock that stayed put was called autochthonous, and if it had moved, it was allochthonous. Normal meant at right angles. Normal also meant a fault with a depressed hanging wall. There was a Green River Basin in Wyoming that was not to be confused with the Green River Basin in Wyoming. One was topographical and was on Wyoming. The other was structural and was under Wyoming. The Great Basin, which is centered in Utah and Nevada, was not to be confused with the Basin and Range, which is centered in Utah and Nevada. The Great Basin was topographical and extraordinary in the world as a vastness of land that had no drainage to the sea. The Basin and Range was a realm of related mountains that coincided with the Great Basin, spilling over slightly to the north and considerably to the south. To anyone with a smoothly functioning bifocal mind, there was no lack of clarity about Iowa in the Pennsylvanian, Missouri in the Mississippian, Nevada in the Nebraskan, Indiana in the Illinoisan, Vermont in the Kansan, Texas in Wisconsin in time. Meteoric water, with study, turned out to be rain. It ran downhill in consequent, subsequent, obsequent, resequent, and not a few insequent streams. As years went by, such variable deposits would thicken. Someone developed enough effrontery to call a piece of our earth an epiuogeosyncline. There were those who said interfluve when they meant between 2 streams, and a perfectly good word like Mesopotamian would do. A cactolith, according to the American Geologic Institute's Glossary of Geology and Related Science, was a quasi-horizontal chronolith comprised of anastasizing ductoliths, whose distal ends curl like a harpolith, thin like a sphenolith, or bulge discordantly like an acmolith or ethmolith. The same class of people who called one rock serpentine called another jacuperangite, clinotiptolite, ectolite, migmatite, tincanolite, zabelite, pumpitolite, meyerhoferite. The same class of people who called one rock periclesium called another despehosalite, metakerchaheimerite, phlogopite, katsambucolite, mabozolite, nosolite, neighborite, samsonite, pigeonite, muskoxite, pabstite, enigmatite, joe-smithite. With the X-ray diffractometer and the X-ray fluorescence spectrometer, which came into general use in geology laboratories in the late 1950s, and then with the electron probe around 1970, geologists obtained ever closer examinations of the components of rock. What they had long seen through magnifying lenses as specimens held in the hand, or in thin slices under microscopes, did not always register identically in the eyes of these machines. Andesite, for example, had been given its name for being the predominant rock of the high mountains of South America. According to the machines, there is surprisingly little andesite in the Andes. The Sierra Nevada is renowned throughout the world for its relatively young and absolutely beautiful granite. There is precious little granite in the Sierra. Yosemite Falls, Half Dome, El Capitan. For the most part, the granite of the Sierra is granodiorite. It has always been difficult enough to hold in the mind that a magma which hardens in the earth as granite will, if it should flow out upon the earth, harden as rhyolite, that what hardens within the earth as diorite will harden upon the earth as andesite, and that what hardens within the earth as gabbro will harden upon the earth as basalt, the difference from pair to pair being a matter of chemical composition, and the differences within each pair being a matter of texture and crystalline form, with darker rock at the gabbro end and the lighter rock at the granite. All of that, not to mention such wee appendices as the fact that diabase is a spectral texture of gabbro, was difficult enough for the layman to remember before diffractometers and spectrometers and the electron probes came along to present their multiplex cavils. What had previously been described as the granite of the world turned out to be a large family of rock that included granodiorite, monzonite, syenite, adamelite, trajonderite, alaskite, and a modest amount of true granite. A great deal of rhyolite, under scrutiny, became dacite, rhyodacite, quartz latite. Andesite was found to contain enough silica, potassium, sodium, and aluminum to be the fraternal twin of granodiorite. These points are pretty fine. The home terms still apply. The enthusiasm geologists show for adding new words to their conversation is, if anything, exceeded by their affection for the old. They are not about to drop granite. They say granodiorite when they are in church, and granite the rest of the week. When I was 17 and staring up at the skirts of the eastern valleys, I was taught the rudiments of what is now referred to as the old geology. The new geology is the package phrase for the effects of the revolution that occurred in the earth science in the 1960s, when geologists clambered onto seafloor spreading, when people began to discuss continents in terms of their velocities, and when the interactions of some 20 parts of the globe became known as plate tectonics. There were few hints of all that when I was 17, and now, a shake later, middle-aged and fading, I wanted to learn some geology again, to feel the difference between the old and the new, to sense, if possible, how the science had settled down a decade after its great upheaval, but less in megapictures than in day-to-day contact with country rock, seeing what had not changed as well as what had changed. The thought occurred to me that if you were to walk a series of road cuts with a geologist, something illuminating would in all likelihood occur. This was long before I met Karen Kleinsburn, or for that matter, David Love of the United States Geologic Survey, or Anita Harris, also of the Survey, or Eldridge Moritz of the University of California, Davis, all of whom would eventually take me with them through various stretches of the continent. What I did first off was what anyone would do. I called my local geologist. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, and the man I got in touch with was Kenneth DeFaze, a senior professor who teaches geology at Princeton University. In an assignment that is angled wide, students who have little aptitude for the sciences are required to take a course or two in the sciences en route to some cerebral Valhalla dangled high by the designers of the curriculum. DeFaze's course is one that such students are drawn to subject. He calls it Earth and its Resources. They call it Rocks for Jocks. DeFaze is a big man with a tenured waistline. His hair flies behind him like Ludwig van Beethoven's. He lectures in sneakers. His voice is syllabic, elocutionary, operatic. He has been described by a colleague as an intellectual roving shortstop with more ideas per square meter than anyone else in the department. They just tumble out. His surname rhymes with the Maze. He has been a geological engineer, a chemical oceanographer, and a sedimentary petrologist. As he lectures, his eyes search the hall. He is careful to be clear, but also to bring forth the full promise of his topic, for he knows that while the odd jock and the pale poet are the white of his target, the bull's-eye is the future geologist. Undergraduates do not come to Princeton intending to study geology. When freshmen fill out cards stating their three principal interests, no one includes rocks. Those who will make the subject their field of major study become interested after they arrive. It is up to DeFays to interest them, and not a few of them, or his department goes into a subduction zone. So his eyes search the hall. People out of his course have been drafted by the Sacramento Kings and have set records in distance running. They have also become professors of geologic geophysics at Caltech and of petrology at Harvard. DeFay's own research has gone from basin and range sediments to the floor of the deep sea to unimaginable events in the mantle, but his enthusiasms are Catholic, and he appears to be less attached to any one part of the story than to the entire narrative of geology in its four-dimensional recapitulations of space and time. His goals as a teacher are ambitious to the point of irrationality. At the very least, he seems to expect 100 mint geologists to emerge from his course. Expects, perhaps, to turn on his television and see a certified igneous petrographer up front with the starting kings. I came to know DeFays when I was wondering how gold gets into mountains. I knew that most old-time hard rock prospectors had little to go on but an association of gold with quartz. And I knew the erosional details of how quartz comes out of the mountains and into the rubble of streams. What I wanted to learn was what put the gold into the mountains in the first place. I asked a historical geologist and a geomorphologist. They both recommended DeFays. He explained that gold is not merely rare. It can be said to love itself. It is, with platinum, the noblest of the noble metals, those which resist combination with other elements. Gold wants to be free. In cool crust rock, it generally is free. At very high temperatures, however, it will go into compounds, and the gold that is among the magmatic fluids in certain pockets of the interior Earth may be combined, for example, with chlorine. Gold chloride is modestly soluble and will dissolve in water that comes down and circulates in the magma. The water picks up many other elements too: potassium, sodium, silicon. Heated, the solution rises into fissures in hard crust rock, where the cooling gold breaks away from chlorine and, in specks, in flakes, in nuggets even larger than the eggs of geese, falls out of the water as metal. Silicon precipitates too, filling up the fissures and enveloping the gold with veins of silicon dioxide, which is quartz. When I asked DeFays what one might expect from a close inspection of road cuts, he said they were windows into the world as it was in other times. We made plans to take samples of highway rock. I suggested going north up some new interstate to see what the blasting had discovered. He said if you go north, in most places on this continent, the geology does not greatly vary. You should proceed in the direction of the continent itself. Go west. I had been thinking of a weekend trip to Whiteface Mountain, or something like it, but now, suddenly, a vaulting alternative came to mind. What about Interstate 80? I asked him. It goes the distance. How would it be? Absorbing, he said, and he mused aloud. After 80 crosses the border fault, it pussyfoots along the morainal till that leveled up the fingers of the Fold Belt Hills. It does a similar dance with glacial debris in parts of Pennsylvania. It needs no assistance on the Craton. It climbs a ramp to the Rockies and fault-block staircase up the front of the Sierra. It is geologically shrewd. It was the route of the animal migrations and of human history that followed. It avoids the melodrama, avoids the Grand Canyons, the Jackson Holes, the geologic operas of the country, but would surely be a sound experience of the big picture, of the history, the construction, the components of the continent. And, in all likelihood, it would display in its road cuts rock from every epoch and era. In seasons that followed, I would go back and forth across the interstate like some sort of shuttle working out on a loom, accompanied by geologists on purposes of their own, or being accompanied by them from cut to cut and coast to coast. At any location on Earth, as the rock record goes down into time and out into earlier geographies, it touches upon tens of hundreds of stories, wherein the face of the Earth often changed utterly, and changed again, like one of the face of the crackling fire. The rock beside the road exposes one or two levels of the column of time and generally implies what went on immediately below and what occurred, or what never occurred, above. To tell all the stories would be pretty much to tell the whole of geology in many volumes across a 50-foot shelf, a task for which I am in every conceivable way unqualified. I am a layman who has traveled with a small core sampling of academic and government geologists, ranging in experience from a student to an émergé gris. I don't care how to pronounce that. I wish to make no attempt to speak for all geology or to sweep in every fact that came along. I want to choose some things that interested me, and through them suggest the general history of the continent by describing events and landscapes that geologists see written in rocks. To poke around in a preliminary way, DeFays and I went up to the Palisades Sill, where I was to return with Karen Kleinsman, borrowed some diabase with a 10-pound sledge, and then began to travel westward, traversing the Hackensack Valley. It was morning. Small airplanes engorged with businessmen were settling into Teterboro. DeFays pointed out that if this were near the end of Wisconsin time, when the ice was in retreat, those airplanes would have been settling down through several hundred feet of water, with the runway at the bottom of a lake. Glacial Lake Hackensack was the size of Lake Geneva and was host to many islands. It had the Palisade Sill for an eastern shoreline, and on the west the lava hill that is now known as the first Watchung Mountain. The glacier had stopped at Perth Amboy, leaving its moraine there to block the foot of the lake, which the glacier fed with meltwater as it retreated to the north. Some 200 million years later, the runway would have been laid out on a baking red flat beside the first cooling Watchung, glowing from cracks, from lava fountains, but generally black as carbon. Basalt doesn't light up the sky. 300 million years before that, the airplanes would have been settling down toward the same site through water. In this instance, saltwater, on the eastern shelf of a broad, low continent, where an almost pure limestone was forming, because virtually nothing from the worn-away continent was eroding into the shallow sea. 3 random moments from the upper ninth of time. In Patterson, I-80 chops the Watchung area, the Watchung lava. Walking the cut from end to end, DeFaze picks up some peripheral shale, Triassic red shale. He puts it in his mouth and chews it. If it's gritty, it's a silt bed. If it's creamy, it's a shale, he said. This is creamy. Try it. I would not have thought to put it in coffee. In the blocky basaltic wall of the road, there were many small pockets, caves the size of peas, caves the size of lemons. As magma approaches the surface of the earth, it is so perfused with gases that it fizzles like ginger ale. In cooling basalt, gas bubbles remain, and from these, mini-caves. For a century and more, nothing much fills them. Slowly, though, over a minimum of about 1 million years, they can fill with zeolite crystals. Until well after the Second World War, not a whole lot was known about the potential uses of zeolite crystals, nor was it known where they could be found in abundance. DeFaze did important early work in the field. His doctoral dissertation, which dealt with 2 basins and 2 ranges in Nevada, included an appendix that started the zeolite industry. Certain zeolites, there are about 30 kinds, have become the predominant catalysts in use in oil refineries, doing a job that is otherwise assigned to platinum. Now, in Patterson, DeFaze searches the roadcut vugs, as the minute caves are actually called, looking for zeolites. Some vugs were large enough to suggest holes that lobsters hid in. They did indeed contain a number of white fibrous zeolite crystals, smooth and soapy, of a type that resembled talc or asbestos. But the cut had almost entirely been cleaned out by professional and amateur collectors, undeterred by the lethal traffic not many inches away. Nearly all the vugs were now as empty as they had been in their first 100 years. In the shale beyond the lava, we saw the burrows of Triassic creatures. An ambulance from Tawatawa flew by with its siren wailing. We moved on a few miles into the great Peace Meadows of the Passaic River Valley, flat as a lake floor, poorly drained land. A meadow in New Jersey is any wet sponge acreage where you don't want to sink in above your chin. Great Peace Meadows, Troy Meadows, Black Meadows, the Great Swamp, Whippany, Parsippany, Madison, and Morristown are strewn among the reeds. The whole region, very evidently, was the bottom of a lake, for a lake itself is, by definition, a sign of poor drainage, an aneurysm in a river, a highly temporary feature on the land. Some lakes dry up. Others disappear after the outlet stream, deepening its valley and eroding headward into the outlet, empties the water. This one, Glacial Lake Passaic, vanished about 10,000 years ago after the retreating glacier exposed what is now the Passaic Valley. The lake drained gradually into the new Passaic River, which fell 100 feet into Glacial Lake Hackensack and, en route, went over a waterfall that would one day, in effect, found the city of Patterson by turning its first mill wheel. At the time of its greatest extent, Lake Passaic was 200 feet deep, 30 miles long, and 10 miles wide, and seems to have been a scene of great beauty. Its margins were still decorated with sand spits and offshore bars, wave-cut cliffs and stream deltas, set in suburban towns. The lake's west shore was the worn, low escarpment of the border fault, and its most arresting feature was a hook-shaped basaltic peninsula that is now known to geologists as a part of the third Watchung lava flow and to the people of New Jersey as Hook Mountain. DeFaze became excited as we approached Hook Mountain. The interstate had blasted into one toe of the former peninsula, exposing its interior to view. DeFaze said, "Maybe someone will have left some zeolite here. I want them so bad I can taste them." He jumped the curb with his high-slung geology department vehicle, got out his hammers, and walked the cut. It was steep and competent, with brown oxides of iron over the felt-textured black basalt, and in it were tens of thousands of tiny vugs, a high percentage of them filled with pearl-lustered crystals of zeolite. To take a close look, he opened his hand lens, a small-diameter, 10-power Hastings triplet. "You can do a nice act in a jewelry store, he suggested. You whip this thing out and you say a price is too high. These are beautiful crystals. Beautiful crystals imply slow growth. You don't get in a hurry and make something that nice." He picked up the sledge and pounded the cut, necessarily smashing many crystals before he broke their matrix free. These crystals are like Vietnamese villages, he went on. You have to destroy them in order to preserve them. They contain aluminum, silicon, calcium, sodium, and an incredible amount of imprisoned water. Zeolite means it's the stone that boils. If you take one small zeolite crystal of scarcely more than a pinhead's diameter and heat it until the water has come out, the crystal will have an internal surface area equivalent to a bedspread. Zeolites are often used to separate one kind of molecule from another. They can, for example, sort out molecules for detergents, choosing ones that are biodegradable. They love water. In refrigerators, they are used to absorb water that accidentally gets into the Freon. They could be used in automobile gas tanks to absorb water. A zeolite called clinoptidylite is the strongest absorber of strontium and cesium from radioactive wastes. The clinoptidylite will absorb a great deal of lethal material, and when you can store them in a small place. When William Wyler made The Big Country, there was a climatic chase scene in which the bad guy was shot and came clattering down a canyon wall in what appeared to be a shower of clinoptidylite. Geologists were on the phone to Wyler at once. Loved your movie. Where was that canyon? There are a lot of zeolites in the Alps, in Nova Scotia, and in North Table Mountain in Colorado. When I was at the School of Mines, I used to go up to North Table Mountain just to wham around. Some of the best zeolites in the world are in this part of New Jersey. There were oaks and maples on top of Hook Mountain, and, in the wall of the road cut, basalt rosettes of woody mullein growing into the rock. The Romans drenched salts of mullein with suet and used them for funeral torches. American Indians taught the early pioneers to use the long flannel leaves of this plant as innersoles. Only 3 miles west of us was the border fault, where the basin had touched the range, where the stubby remnants of the fault scarp were now under glacial debris. DeFay said that the displacement along the fault, the eventual difference between 2 points that had been adjacent when the faulting began, exceeded 15,000 feet. Of course, this happened over several million years, and the mountains fronting the basin were all the while eroding. So they were never anything like 15,000 feet high. Generally, though, in the late Triassic, there would have been about a mile of difference. A mile of relief between basin and range. In flash floods, boulders came raining off the mountains and piled in fans at the edge of the basin, ultimately to be filled in with sands and muds and to form conglomerate, New Jersey's so-called Hammer Creek conglomerate. Multi-circled, polka-dotted head cheese rock, sometimes known as pudding stone. Here, where the basin met the range, the sediments piled up so much that after all the erosion of 200 million years, what remains is 3 miles thick. I was in a bar once in Austin, Nevada, DeFay said, and there was a sudden torrential downpour. The bartender began nailing plywood over the door. I wondered why he was doing that, until boulders came tumbling down the main street of the town. When you start pulling a continent apart, you have a lot of consequences of the same event. Faulting produced this basin. Sediments filled it in. Pull things apart, and you produce a surface vacancy, which is faulting, and a subsurface vacancy, which causes upwelling of hot mantle that intrudes as sills or comes out as lava flows. In the old geology, you might have seen a sill within the country rock and thought, the sill came much later. With the new geology, you see that all this was happening more or less at one time. The continent was splitting apart, and the ultimate event was the opening of the Atlantic. If you look at the fold belt in northwest Africa, you see the other side of the New Jersey story. The folding there is of the same age as the Appalachians, and the subsequent faulting is Triassic. Put the two continents together on a map, and you will see what I mean. Fault blocks like this one are still in evidence, but discontinuously from the Connecticut Valley to South Carolina. They are all parts of the suite that opened the Atlantic Seaway. The story is very similar to the Great Basin, in the west, in the Basin and Range. The Earth is splitting apart there, quite possibly opening a seaway. It is not something that happened a couple 100 million years ago. It only began in the Miocene, and it's still going on today. What we were looking at here in New Jersey is not just some little geologic feature, like a zeolite crystal. This is the opening of the Atlantic. If you want to see it happening right now, what happened here 200 million years ago, you can go see it in Nevada. And we'll stop there. Thanks for listening, and come back next week. Who knows, we might still be on geology. Maybe we'll move on to something new and fun. But for now, keep your stick on the ice.